It was a quiet Tuesday evening in the city of Brooksville, where Officer Greg Malone sat behind the wheel of his patrol car. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets. He adjusted his seatbelt and sighed deeply, staring out at the neighborhood before him. It wasn't one he particularly enjoyed patrolling. For years, this area had been labeled as trouble by many in the police department. To Greg, it felt like a place where opportunities went to die, where people didn't seem to care about breaking rules or living right. Greg wasn't always such a skeptical man. When he first joined the force, he believed in justice, fairness, and doing what was right. But over time, things changed. The weight of seeing crime after crime, arrest after arrest, wore on him. He started noticing patterns, or at least what he thought were patterns. Certain neighborhoods seemed to have more problems than others. Certain faces appeared again and again in mugshots, and certain attitudes made him feel like some people just didn't want help. Tonight, though, something felt different. As Greg drove slowly down Maple Street, his eyes scanned the parked cars along the curb. Most of them were old sedans with dents and scratches, but one vehicle caught his attention immediately. A sleek black sedan gleamed under the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. It looked expensive, out of place for this part of town. His curiosity piqued, Greg slowed the car further and glanced around. There was no sign of anyone nearby, so he decided to pull over and take a closer look. The license plate check came back clean, which surprised him. No outstanding tickets, no criminal record associated with the owner. The name registered to the plate read, Michelle Carter. Nothing unusual there either. Still, something about the situation nagged at him. Why would someone driving such an expensive car be parked here? This wasn't exactly a high-end neighborhood. People didn't come here to visit friends or shop. They came here because they couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Or at least that's what Greg told himself. As he sat there, lost in thought, the driver's door of the black sedan opened. Out stepped a woman who looked nothing like the image Greg had conjured up in his mind. She was tall and confident, dressed in a business suit that screamed professionalism. Her hair was neatly styled, and she carried herself with an air of authority. If Greg hadn't known better, he might have mistaken her for a lawyer or corporate executive, not someone who belonged in this gritty corner of the city. "Evening, ma'am," Greg said as he approached her. He kept his tone polite but firm, trying not to let his assumptions show through. "Is everything okay? I noticed your car has been sitting here for a while." Michelle smiled faintly, clearly unbothered by his presence. "Good evening, officer," she replied smoothly. "Everything's fine. I'm just waiting for a friend. They should be out shortly." Her calm demeanor threw Greg off balance. He'd expected hesitation, maybe even defensiveness. Instead, she spoke with ease, as if being questioned by a police officer was no big deal. Maybe it really wasn't to her, but that only deepened his suspicions. Who was this woman? What was she doing here? And why did she seem so unfazed? "Well, ma'am," Greg said, shifting slightly to block her view of the patrol car's dashboard. "Computer, I'll need to see your license and registration if you don't mind." "Of course," Michelle said, reaching into her purse without hesitation. She handed over the requested documents, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Greg studied them carefully, looking for any hint of irregularity. Everything checked. Out. Her license was valid and the registration matched the car. Yet, despite all evidence pointing to her innocence, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He ran her information through the system again, hoping for anything that might justify his instincts. Drug charges? Outstanding. Warrants? Anything at all? But once again, the results came back clean. Michelle Carter was, according to every database available to him, a model citizen. No red flags, no warnings, nothing. That's when it hit him. The idea forming in his mind wasn't entirely new. In fact, it had crossed his thoughts before during similar situations. Not everyone who broke the law got caught. Some people were smarter, sneakier, better at covering their tracks. Maybe Michelle was one of those people. Maybe she was involved in something bigger than what met the eye. Greg knew he was treading dangerous ground. Planting evidence was illegal, unethical, and could ruin careers. But desperation clouded his judgment. He convinced himself that if she truly was innocent, she'd find a way to prove it. And if she wasn't, well, then he'd done his job by taking another bad guy off the streets. With that twisted logic guiding him, Greg began formulating a plan. He asked Michelle to step out of the car, citing standard procedure for a routine search. She complied without argument, standing patiently beside him while he rummaged through her vehicle. Inside, everything seemed ordinary. Maps, sunglasses, a spare tire. Nothing incriminating. Until, that is, Greg slipped a small baggie containing white powder into the glove compartment. It happened quickly, almost too fast for anyone to notice. One moment, he was searching. The next, he was holding up the baggie triumphantly. "Ma'am," he said, turning to face her. "I found this in your car. Do you care to explain?" Michelle's expression remained neutral, though her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "That's not mine," she stated firmly. "I've never seen that before." Greg nodded, pretending to consider her words. "I understand, ma'am, but unfortunately we're going to have to take this downtown for processing. You're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." For a brief second, Greg allowed himself to feel a sense of satisfaction. He'd done it. He'd caught someone skirting the law, someone who thought she was above consequences. But as Michelle stood there, hands cuffed behind her back, he couldn't ignore the tiny voice whispering in the back of his mind. Something about this whole scenario felt wrong. Too easy. Too convenient. Little did Greg know, Michelle Carter wasn't just any woman. She was a highly trained DEA official, currently working undercover to dismantle one of the largest drug trafficking networks in the country. Every move she made, every decision she took was calculated and precise. Being pulled over by a local cop wasn't part of her plan, but it certainly wasn't going to derail it either. As Greg escorted her toward the patrol car, Michelle kept her composure intact. She knew better than to fight back now. This development, unexpected as it was, presented an opportunity, one she intended to use to her advantage. After all, sometimes the best way to catch a predator was to become its prey. The ride to the police station was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Greg sat in the front seat of the patrol car, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. Michelle sat in the back, her hands cuffed behind her back, staring straight ahead through the window. She didn't say a word, didn't protest, didn't even sigh in frustration. Her silence made Greg uneasy. Most people he arrested, guilty or not, would be yelling, pleading, or at least trying to explain themselves. But Michelle? She was calm, almost eerily so. Greg tried to shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. He reminded himself that he'd done what he thought was necessary. If she really was innocent, she'd have her day in court. And if she wasn't, well, then he'd done his job. Still, the nagging doubt lingered in the back of his mind. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but her expression gave nothing away. It was as if she had already moved past the situation, planning her next move while he was still stuck, wrestling with his own guilt. When they arrived at the station, Greg led Michelle inside and handed her over to the booking officer. The process was routine: photos, fingerprints, paperwork. Michelle cooperated fully, answering questions when asked but keeping her responses short and to the point. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even seem particularly upset. To anyone watching, it might have looked like she was simply resigned to her fate. But Greg knew better. Or at least, he suspected there was more going on beneath the surface. Finally, after what felt like hours, Michelle was taken to a holding cell. It wasn't much. A small room with concrete walls, a metal bench, and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Greg stood outside the cell, watching her through the bars. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no anger in hers, no fear, no desperation. Just a quiet confidence that sent a chill down Greg's spine. "I want to make a phone call," Michelle said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "I'm entitled to one." Greg hesitated. He knew. She was right. She was entitled to a phone call just like anyone else who'd been arrested. But something about the way she said it made him nervous. Was she calling a lawyer, a friend, or someone else entirely? He couldn't put his finger on it, but he had the sinking feeling that this arrest wasn't going to go as smoothly as he'd hoped. Fine, Greg muttered, unlocking the cell door. But don't try anything funny. Michelle stepped out without hesitation, following him to a nearby desk where a landline phone sat. Greg hovered nearby, close enough to hear her side of the conversation but far enough to give the illusion of privacy. She picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory, waiting patiently as the line rang. When someone answered on the other end, Michelle spoke in a low, measured tone. "It's me," she said simply. "I've been detained. Brooksville, PD. You know what to do." That was all she said before hanging up. Greg frowned, his unease growing. Those few words, cryptic, brief, and deliberate, sounded less like a plea for help and more like a coded message. Who was she talking to? What did they know to do? Greg wanted to ask, to demand answers, but he held his tongue. Instead, he escorted her back to the holding cell and locked the door behind her. As the minutes ticked by, Greg found himself pacing the hallway outside the cells. He told himself he was just being thorough, making sure everything was in order. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was stalling. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He kept replaying the events of the evening in his head, searching for clues he might have missed. Had he been too hasty, too quick to judge? He didn't want to admit it, but the possibility was there. It wasn't long before the first sign of trouble arrived. The front doors of the station burst open, and a group of sharply dressed men and women walked in, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They introduced themselves as agents from the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, and they wasted no time getting to the point. "We're here for Michelle Carter," one of them said firmly, stepping forward. "She's one of ours." Greg froze, his stomach dropping like a stone. One of theirs? What did that mean? Before he could respond, another agent spoke up, his tone colder and more authoritative. "You need to release her immediately," he said, "and we'll need to speak with whoever is responsible for this arrest." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Greg. He felt like every pair of eyes was piercing through him, judging him, condemning him. His mouth went dry, and for a moment he couldn't find the words to defend himself. Finally, he managed to stammer out a response. "She's under arrest for possession," Greg said weakly, gesturing toward the holding cell. "I found drugs in her car." The lead agent raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Drugs?" he repeated. "In her car? Let's see the evidence." Greg hesitated, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't show them the baggie, not without admitting what he'd done. But refusing to cooperate would only make things worse. Reluctantly, he retrieved the evidence bag and handed it over. The agent examined it closely, turning it over in his hands before looking back at Greg. "This doesn't belong to her," the agent said flatly. "And you know it." Greg opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He glanced at Michelle, who was now standing calmly beside the agents, her hands free of handcuffs. She hadn't said a word since the agents arrived, but her presence alone was enough to fill the room with tension. I followed protocol." Greg stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I searched her car and I found—" "You planted it," Michelle interrupted, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. All eyes turned to her, and for the first time Greg saw a flicker of emotion in her expression. It wasn't anger or hatred, it was disappointment. "You planted that evidence because you assumed I was guilty, because of where I was, because of who you thought I was." Greg felt his face flush with shame. He wanted to deny it, to come up with some excuse that would make sense of his actions. But he couldn't. Not in front of these agents, not in front of her. Slowly, he lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. The agents exchanged glances, their expressions grim. "This is exactly why we're here," one of them said, addressing the room. "We've been investigating corruption within local law enforcement for months. This incident confirms what we've suspected all along." Greg's heart sank as the weight of his actions hit him. He hadn't just broken the law, he'd jeopardized an entire operation. Michelle wasn't just a random person driving through the wrong neighborhood. She was Deputy Director of Operations for the DEA, working undercover to dismantle a major drug trafficking network. And now, thanks to his reckless decision, her cover was blown. What happens now? Greg asked quietly, his voice trembling. He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it. "You'll be suspended pending an investigation," one of the agents replied, "and depending on what we find, you may face criminal charges." Greg nodded numbly, the reality of his situation sinking in. He'd spent years building his career, believing he was doing the right thing. But in one reckless moment, he'd thrown it all away. As the agents led Michelle out of the station, he watched her go, feeling a mix of guilt, regret, and fear. He didn't know what the future held for him, but one thing was certain. He'd never forget the look in Michelle's eyes, the look that told him he'd made a mistake he might never recover from. The next few days were a blur for Greg. His suspension was immediate, and the department placed him on administrative leave while they investigated his actions. At first, he tried to convince himself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe the agents would understand that he was just trying to do his job. Maybe Michelle would choose not to press charges. But deep down, he knew better. What he had done was wrong. There was no way around it. Greg spent most of his time at home staring at the walls or pacing back and forth in his living room. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, searching for some way to justify what he'd done. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the truth. He had let his biases cloud his judgment. He had assumed Michelle was guilty because of where she was and how she looked, and in doing so, he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Meanwhile, Michelle returned to her work with renewed focus. The incident with Greg had been unexpected, but it hadn't derailed her mission. If anything, it had given her valuable insight into the kind of corruption she was fighting against. She knew that Greg wasn't the only officer willing to bend or break the rules. There were others like him, people who believed they were above accountability. And now, more than ever, she was determined to expose them. Michelle met with her team to discuss the situation. They agreed that Greg's actions weren't an isolated incident. His behavior suggested a deeper problem within the police department, a culture of prejudice and misconduct that needed to be addressed. With this in mind, Michelle decided to use the investigation into Greg as an opportunity to dig deeper. She wanted to uncover any connections between local law enforcement and the drug trafficking network she'd been tracking. Over the next several weeks, Michelle worked tirelessly alongside internal affairs investigators. Together, they reviewed records, interviewed officers, and analyzed patterns of behavior. It didn't take long for cracks to start showing. Several officers had questionable histories, unexplained wealth, frequent associations with known criminals, and suspiciously lenient treatment of certain suspects. One name kept coming up again and again: Detective Alan Briggs. Alan was a veteran officer with decades of experience under his belt. To outsiders, he seemed like a model cop, dedicated, hardworking, and respected by his peers. But Michelle and her team soon discovered that appearances could be deceiving. Financial records showed large deposits in Alan's bank account, far beyond what his salary could explain. Phone records revealed frequent calls to individuals linked to the drug trade, and witness statements painted a picture of someone who often turned a blind eye, or worse, actively assisted in illegal activities. Confronting Alan wasn't going to be easy. He was well-connected and fiercely protective of his reputation. But Michelle knew they had enough evidence to bring him in for questioning. She coordinated with internal affairs to set up a meeting, ensuring that everything was handled by the book. When the day came, Alan arrived at the station looking calm and collected, as if he had nothing to worry about. "Detective Briggs," Michelle began, sitting across from him in the interrogation room. "Thank you for coming in today. We have some questions regarding your recent activities." Alan raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Questions about what?" he asked casually. I've been doing my job, same as always. Michelle nodded, keeping her tone neutral. We're aware of your dedication to the force, however. We've uncovered some discrepancies in your financial records. Can you explain these large deposits? Alan hesitated for a moment but quickly recovered. Investments, he said, smoothly. I've been putting money into real estate. You can check if you want. We did, Michelle replied. And those properties don't exist. Care to try again? Alan's expression darkened, but he remained silent. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself. Michelle pressed on, laying out the rest of the evidence piece by piece. Phone records, witness statements, surveillance footage. Each revelation chipped away at his composure, until finally, he cracked. All right, fine, Alan snapped, slamming, his fist on the table. You want the truth? Here it is. I helped some people out, okay? They paid me to look the other way, but I never hurt anyone. I never put innocent lives at risk. That's not entirely accurate, Michelle said quietly. Your actions allowed dangerous criminals to operate freely. People have died because of what you've done. Alan slumped back in his chair, defeated. He buried his face in his hands, muttering apologies under his breath. But Michelle knew there was no going back for him. His confession was just the beginning. Over the following days, the investigation expanded, revealing a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Alan. Other officers were implicated, along with city officials and even a few judges. It was clear that the problem ran deep. As the DEA scandal unfolded, Greg watched from the sidelines, his guilt growing heavier with each new development. He realized now that his actions had been part of a much larger issue, an issue he had ignored for too long. He thought back to all the times he'd dismissed complaints about racial profiling or brushed off concerns about misconduct. He had been complicit whether he meant to be or not. One evening, after another sleepless night, Greg made a decision. He contacted Internal Affairs and requested a meeting. When he arrived, he found Michelle waiting for him. She didn't say anything as he sat down across from her, but her presence alone was enough to remind him of the gravity of the situation. I need to confess, Greg said, his voice trembling. Not just about planting the evidence, about everything. I've been wrong, about so many things. Michelle listened patiently as Greg spoke, recounting years of prejudice and poor judgment. He admitted to profiling people based on their race, ignoring signs of corruption within the department, and letting his frustrations get the better of him. By the time he finished, tears were streaming down his face. When he finally fell silent, Michelle leaned forward slightly. What you've done is serious, she said. But admitting it is the first step toward making things right. Are you willing to cooperate fully with the investigation? Greg nodded without hesitation. Yes. Whatever it takes. Michelle studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. Your cooperation will help us dismantle this network once and for all, but remember, this isn't just about saving yourself. It's about fixing a broken system. Greg left the meeting feeling a mix of emotions, relief, shame, and a glimmer of hope. He knew he still had a long road ahead of him, both personally and professionally. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. As the investigation continued, Michelle and her team worked tirelessly to hold everyone accountable. Officers involved in the corruption were arrested, stripped of their badges and charged with various crimes. City officials faced public scrutiny, leading to resignations and reforms. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. For Michelle, the victory was bittersweet. While she was proud of what they had accomplished, she knew the fight was far from over. Corruption was a persistent enemy, one that required constant vigilance. Still, she took solace in knowing that they had made a difference, and that justice, however imperfect, had prevailed. As for Greg, he began attending counseling sessions and community meetings, hoping to learn from his mistakes and rebuild trust. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to change, not just for himself, but for the sake of those he had wronged. Little by little, he started to see the world through a different lens, one that wasn't clouded by bias or fear. In the end, the case served as a reminder of two important truths: that even those sworn to uphold the law are capable of breaking it, and that redemption is possible, but only when accompanied by honesty, accountability, and a willingness to grow. The weeks that followed Greg's confession were a whirlwind of activity. The investigation into the corruption within the police department had grown larger than anyone could have imagined. What started as a single case involving one officer, Greg Malone, had snowballed into a massive operation uncovering systemic issues that went far beyond Brooksville. The scandal made headlines across the country, sparking debates about accountability in law enforcement and the need for reform. For Greg, every day felt like a test of his resolve. He had agreed to cooperate fully with internal affairs and the DEA, providing detailed accounts of everything he knew, or thought he knew, about corrupt practices within the department. At first, it was difficult. Many of the people implicated were colleagues he had worked alongside for years. Some had even been friends. Sitting in front of investigators and naming names felt like betrayal, but Greg reminded himself why he was doing it. He wasn't just trying to save his own career. He was helping to expose a system that had failed so many people. Michelle Carter played a central role in guiding the investigation. Her position as Deputy Director of Operations gave her the authority and resources needed to ensure nothing was overlooked. She oversaw teams of agents who combed through files, conducted interviews, and pieced together evidence. It was grueling work, but Michelle refused to let up. She knew this was her chance to make lasting change, not just for Brooksville, but for communities everywhere affected by similar issues. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when Michelle's team discovered a network of officers who had been accepting bribes from local gangs. These gangs operated under the radar, using intimidation and violence to maintain control over neighborhoods. The officers involved didn't just ignore their activities, they actively protected them, tipping them off about raids or arrests, and ensuring they stayed out of trouble. In exchange, the gangs provided money, drugs, and other perks. The revelation shocked even those familiar with police corruption. It painted a picture of a deeply entrenched alliance between criminals and law enforcement, one that had gone unchecked for years. As more officers were arrested and charged, public outrage grew. Protesters gathered outside the police station, demanding justice and calling for sweeping reforms. Community leaders joined the chorus, urging transparency and accountability at every level. Amid the chaos, Greg found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt a sense of relief knowing that these corrupt officers were being held accountable. On the other hand, he couldn't escape the guilt of knowing he had once been part of the same system. His decision to plant fake evidence in Michelle's car now seemed like the final straw, the moment when his biases and poor judgment reached a breaking point. He often wondered if he deserved any mercy, especially after seeing how much damage his actions had caused. To cope, Greg threw himself into community service. As part of his agreement with internal affairs, he was required to speak publicly about the dangers of racial profiling and unchecked bias. At first, the idea terrified him. Standing in front of crowds and admitting his mistakes felt like walking onto a stage naked. But as he began sharing his story, something unexpected happened. People listened, not just to judge him, but to understand how someone could go down such a destructive path. During one particularly emotional session, Greg stood before a group of high school students. They were young, curious, and eager to learn. Greg took a deep breath and began speaking. "When I became a police officer," he said, "I thought I was joining a force dedicated to protecting people, but somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I started making assumptions about people based on where they lived, how they looked, or what neighborhood they were from. Those assumptions led me to do things I'm not proud of." He paused, looking around the room. The students were silent, hanging on his every word. "I want you to know that what I did was wrong," he continued. "It hurt innocent people, including someone who was working hard to make our community safer. I can't undo the past, but I can try to make things right. That starts with learning from my mistakes and teaching others not to repeat them." By the time he finished, several students approached him to ask questions. Some expressed anger, while others showed sympathy. Greg welcomed both reactions, knowing that honest conversations were the first step toward healing. As the investigation progressed, Michelle kept a close eye on Greg's progress. She saw how hard he was working to confront his past and make amends. While she still harbored some resentment toward him for jeopardizing her mission, she couldn't deny the sincerity of his efforts. One afternoon, she decided to meet with him privately. "Greg," she said as they sat in a quiet corner of the precinct, "you've come a long way since that night. I won't pretend it's easy to forgive what happened, but I can see you're genuinely trying to change." Greg nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for saying that. I don't expect forgiveness, but hearing it means more than you know." Michelle leaned forward slightly. "You have an opportunity here to turn your experience into something positive. Use your story to educate others. Show them that bias doesn't just harm individuals, it weakens entire systems." Greg promised to keep pushing forward, determined to use his second chance wisely. Meanwhile, Michelle focused on implementing reforms within the department. She worked closely with city officials to introduce new policies aimed at preventing future corruption. Training programs were revamped to emphasize ethics, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of accountability. Officers were encouraged to report suspicious behavior without fear of retaliation. Slowly but surely, the culture began to shift. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Not everyone welcomed the changes. Some officers resented the increased scrutiny, arguing that it made their jobs harder. Others worried that the reforms would paint all law enforcement in a negative light. Michelle understood their concerns but remained firm in her belief that accountability was essential for rebuilding trust. As the months passed, the impact of the investigation became clearer. Arrests tied to the drug trafficking network surged, thanks to the dismantling of the corrupt officers' protection racket. Neighborhoods once plagued by violence began to see improvements. Residents reported feeling safer and more hopeful about the future. While there was still much work to be done, the tide was turning. For Michelle, the victory was personal. She had spent years dedicating her life to fighting injustice, often at great personal cost. Seeing the results of her efforts reinforced her commitment to the cause. She knew the fight against corruption would never truly end. It was a constant battle. But she also knew that moments like these proved it was worth it. As for Greg, he continued to rebuild his life, one small step at a time. He volunteered at youth centers, mentored aspiring officers, and spoke openly about the lessons he had learned. Though he would never regain the trust he had lost, he hoped his actions might inspire others to reflect on their own biases and strive for better. In the end, the case served as a powerful reminder of the complexities of human nature. It showed how easily good intentions could be twisted by prejudice and fear, but also how redemption was possible with honesty and effort. For Michelle and Greg, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by mistakes, but by growth, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. Months passed, and the city of Brooksville slowly began to heal. The investigation into police corruption had shaken the community to its core, but it also opened the door for meaningful change. People who had long felt ignored or mistreated by law enforcement started speaking up, sharing their stories in town hall meetings and online forums. For the first time in years, there was a sense of hope that things could be different, that justice wasn't just a word written in laws, but something real and attainable. Greg Malone's life had changed dramatically since his suspension. He no longer wore a badge, but he still played an important role in the community. His public speaking engagements became more frequent, and he found himself invited to schools, churches, and civic organizations to talk about accountability and bias. At first, Greg struggled with the attention. He didn't see himself as a hero or even a role model. To him, he was simply someone trying to make amends for his mistakes. But over time, he realized that his story resonated with others because it was raw and honest. It showed that even those who made grave errors could take steps toward redemption. One evening, Greg stood before a packed auditorium at Brooksville Community College. The audience included students, professors, and local residents, all eager to hear what he had to say. As he adjusted the microphone and glanced at the crowd, he felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. Public speaking was never easy for him, but tonight he knew his words mattered. "I'm not here to tell you I have all the answers," Greg began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "In fact, I've spent the last few months realizing how little I actually knew. I thought I understood people, what motivated them, what scared them, what made them tick. But I was wrong. Dead wrong." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. For years, I let my assumptions guide me. If someone looked a certain way or lived in a certain neighborhood, I assumed the worst. Those assumptions led me to do terrible things. Things I'll regret for the rest of my life. One night, they led me to plant fake evidence in a woman's car. That woman turned out to be Michelle Carter, a top official in the DEA. She was working undercover to stop dangerous criminals, and I almost ruined her mission because of my biases. Greg took a deep breath, his hands gripping the sides of the podium. What happened that night taught me something painful but important. We're all capable of making bad decisions, but we're also capable of learning from them. And that's what I'm trying to do now: learn, grow, and help others avoid the same mistakes. When Greg finished speaking, the audience erupted into applause. Several people approached him afterward to shake his hand or thank him for his honesty. Among them was a young man named Jamal, who introduced himself as a college student studying criminal justice. "Mr. Malone," Jamal said, his expression serious, "I want to join the police force someday, but hearing your story makes me wonder, if I can really make a difference, how do I know I won't end up like you or worse?" Greg looked at Jamal for a moment, considering his response carefully. "You won't always get it right," he admitted. "No one does. But the key is to stay humble and keep learning. Listen to the people around you, especially the ones who look different from you or come from different backgrounds. Don't assume you know their story. Ask questions, seek advice, and hold yourself accountable when you mess up. That's how you make a difference." Jamal nodded thoughtfully, and Greg felt a flicker of pride. Maybe his efforts weren't entirely in vain. Maybe, just maybe, he could leave a positive mark on the next generation. While Greg worked to rebuild trust within the community, Michelle Carter continued her fight against corruption. The case in Brooksville had been a turning point, not only for the city but for her career as well. Her leadership during the investigation earned her recognition from higher-ups in the DEA, and she was promoted to oversee operations across multiple states. It was a daunting responsibility, but Michelle welcomed the challenge. She knew the work was far from over. Michelle also took steps to address the systemic issues exposed by the scandal. She collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing transparency in law enforcement. Body cameras became mandatory for officers, and independent review boards were established to investigate complaints of misconduct. Training programs were updated to include modules on implicit bias, cultural competence, and de-escalation tactics. These changes weren't perfect, but they represented progress, a step in the right direction. Despite her busy schedule, Michelle made time to reflect on everything that had happened. Late one night, as she sat alone in her office, she pulled out the file on Greg Malone. She flipped through the pages, reading over his statements and the notes from his counseling sessions. There was no denying the transformation he had undergone. He wasn't the same man who had arrested her that fateful night. Yet Michelle couldn't help but wonder if the system itself was to blame for allowing someone like Greg to fall so far. The truth was, Greg wasn't unique. Countless officers across the country faced similar pressures: long hours, low pay, constant exposure to violence and trauma. Without proper support, it was easy for good intentions to turn sour. Michelle resolved to advocate for better resources for law enforcement, including mental health services and peer support programs. She believed that helping officers cope with stress and burnout was just as important as holding them accountable for wrongdoing. As the months turned into a year, Brooksville began to feel like a different place. Crime rates dropped, and community relations improved. Residents reported feeling safer walking the streets at night, and businesses that had once considered leaving the area decided to stay. While challenges remained, there was a growing sense of optimism that hadn't existed before. For Greg, the journey was far from easy. He still woke up some mornings haunted by guilt, wondering if he deserved the second chance he'd been given. But he reminded himself that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a better future. Every time he spoke to a group of kids or mentored a young officer, he felt a little lighter, as though he was slowly chipping away at the weight of his mistakes. One day, while volunteering at a local youth center, Greg ran into Michelle. It was the first time they'd seen each other since the investigation ended. They exchanged awkward smiles, unsure of what to say. Finally, Michelle broke the silence. "You've done good work, Greg," she said softly. "I've heard about your talks and the impact you've had on the community. Keep going." Greg nodded, his eyes filling with gratitude. "Thank you," he replied. "That means a lot." They parted ways shortly after, but the brief encounter left both of them reflecting on how far they'd come. For Michelle, it reinforced her belief in the power of resilience and determination. For Greg, it served as a reminder that forgiveness, whether from others or oneself, was possible, even after the darkest moments. In the end, the story of Officer Greg Malone and DEA official Michelle Carter wasn't just about corruption or redemption. It was about the choices people made when faced with difficult truths. It was about the courage to confront one's flaws and the strength to push for change. And most importantly, it was about the enduring hope that, no matter how broken the system seemed, individuals could still rise above it to create something better. Brooksville would never forget the scandal that rocked its foundation. But thanks to the efforts of people like Michelle and Greg, it also became a symbol of what was possible when communities came together to demand justice, not just for some, but for everyone.